The tide is out. In the quiet it leaves behind, old things surface, stories that only show themselves when the world goes still. This is low tide lore. Tonight, the last day of the fishing village before the water took it back. Settle in and let the water stay low a while. The folder is thin, gray board, tied twice with cotton tape gone soft as string. On the spine, in a hand that presses too hard on the downstrokes, someone has written Tolt Cove, and under that, in pencil, a second word has been added later, closed. The provincial archive lists it as Fonds 14, and the finding aid is 1 page long. Weather logs, a merchant's day book, a schoolroom register, a stack of resettlement forms with the carbon still faintly blue. Nothing in the box is dated later than the year the last family left. Fonds like this one come to the archive from all along that coast, boxes of a few hundred pages each, some no thicker than a pamphlet, and after the 10th or 11th, you begin to notice the sameness underneath the differences. A merchant's book, a school log, a weather record, and then, always, the forms. I have laid the pages out in the order of a single day, though they were written across many. A cove like this one did not change its hours much from decade to decade, only its number of chimneys smoking. So I read them now as if it were one morning, one noon, one evening, one dark. The weather log opens first light, before the word outport had any need of the past tense. Fog on the water, the entry reads, thick as wool, visibility to the second scary only, wind calm, gulls working the tickle since before light. A tickle, for anyone reading this file later, is the narrow gut of water between an island and the shore, or between two islands, just wide enough for a boat to pass through on the turn. Tolt Cove had one such gut at its mouth, and the fog sat in it like something poured. At this hour, the cove is only sound, oar against thole pin, a punt's bottom knocking the stage, somewhere a bucket set down on wet board, the particular flat ring of galvanized tin. No one writes down the sound of gulls waking. Everyone who lived there simply knew it as the hour itself. The men are already out past the fog line by the time the log is written, jigging for cod on a ledge they call, in the merchant's book 2 pages further on, the old man's garden, though no one now living can say which old man or what he grew there besides fish. The punts and trap skiffs each had a name painted on the transom in whitewash that needed doing over every spring. Names taken from wives and daughters mostly. A Mary Jane, a 2 sisters, a boat simply called Perseverance because someone, once, thought that worth saying out loud on the stern of a boat. The stage stands over the water on legs of black spruce, driven into the cobble and lashed at the crossbeams, and under it the tide works all day at the shadow, in and out, patient as a hand smoothing a bedsheet. By the time the punts come back in, sun is a pale coin behind the fog, not yet burned through. The fish come up over the stage, head on a pew, a short 2-tined fork, and are pitched into the splitting table in one motion the men do not look at while they do it. The splitter's hands know the cod before the light does. Throat cut, gutted, backbone lifted free in one long pull. The whole business closer to a kind of quick, practiced surgery than to butchery. A good splitter can go through a fish every few seconds and never look down. Then the salt. Barrels of it, coarse and gray, shoveled into the fish in the cure house, layer on layer, the smell of it climbing into the fog until the whole cove seems built from brine. The cure house itself was low and dark, one room built tight against the weather, its floor laid with the same black spruce poles as the flakes outside, and inside it the salt sat in its own bin, coarse as gravel, giving off a smell that got into the wood of the building and never left it, cure house or church. Only then does it go out onto the flake, and here the ledger's plain word finally earns its keep. A flake is a platform of black spruce poles laid across a frame of posts, raised waist high off the cobble, so the wind can pass under the fish as well as over it. The fish lie split side up, rank after rank, pale as bone, and a child too young yet for the boats is set to turn them, walking the flake barefoot in dry weather, in gumboots when the ground is wet, flipping each one with a flat wooden turner so both sides get their share of the air. The schoolroom register, further in the folder, records this same child's name against a column marked absent, more days in July than any teacher liked. And beside it, in a different hand, someone has written needed for the flakes, as though that explained the whole of it, which it did. Mid-morning, the fog has not lifted so much as thinned, the way a held breath thins without quite letting go. The cove's far arm, where 3 more stages stood, is still only a suggestion, a darker gray inside the gray. The folder is not all one season, though I have been reading it as a single day. Further back, in a page dated deep winter, the same hand that logged the fog now logs ice. Harbor ice thick enough to walk on, no boat in or out for 6 weeks. Flour low in 3 households, the coastal boat not expected before the ice breaks. Deep winter in a cove like this one meant waiting, mostly. Waiting on the ice, waiting on the boat, waiting on a barrel of flour already promised against next summer's fish before this summer's fish was even swimming. The merchant's daybook is the fattest document in the folder and the dullest to read and the truest to the place. Credit against fish. So many quintals brought in, so much flour, molasses, and twine taken against them, the balance never quite closing, year to year, in the family's favor. A quintal is 112 pounds of dried, salted cod, the old unit the whole coast reckoned by, and a season's whole worth, a family's whole worth, could turn on whether the count came in at 40 quintals or 30. The book does not say much about the families themselves, only their names in a column and their debts beside them. But here and there a note breaks the pattern. Beside one name, in the margin, boy lost off the ledge, no fish taken this month. Nothing further is written, nothing further needed to be. Above the cove, on the one rise of ground flat enough to dig, the folder's map, drawn by hand in a surveyor's pencil, marks a small square, simply as burying ground, no larger than a garden plot itself, headstones of slate where a family could afford it, of painted wood where they could not. When the resettlement came, the graveyard almost never went with the houses. It could not be floated on a barge of oil drums, and so it stayed and stays still, the wooden markers long since fallen and gone soft into the ground. The slate ones leaning at the angles, the frost gives everything it has enough years to work on. I set that page down for a moment before going on. The fog outside my own window, 400 miles from that cove, and 80 years later has nothing to do with it. And yet I find I have gone quiet at my desk in the same way the cove must have gone quiet that month. Noon, and the fog burns back at last to a low gray ceiling, high enough that the second skerry shows its black spine, low enough that no boat goes far. This was the hour for mending. Twine, corks, the long committee of the wharf, where men sat on upturned buckets with nets across their knees. The talk at the wharf, what little of it made it into any written record, survives mostly as complaint about weather and prices. But one line, copied by a schoolteacher into the margin of her own log, has stayed with the folder for reasons the file does not explain. She wrote only, "They say the cove was a garden once, before the salt got into it." The schoolteacher who wrote of a garden before the salt got into it signed her log only with initials, boarded, the record shows, with a family 2 doors from the school itself, and stayed by the evidence of the register's handwriting, only the 2 years the form required of her before she could ask for a posting nearer her own people. Nothing else in her hand is half so strange as that one line. The rest of her log is roll call, weather, and the price of chalk, and I find myself grateful, reading it, that she let that one stranger thought through onto the page before going back to her columns. No one now can say what she meant by garden, whether it was a story of an older settlement drowned by higher water, or simply the bitter joke of men who grew nothing here but fish and debt. The line sits alone on the page like a stone left in a furrow. At midday, the women's work fills the middle of the file, though it is named nowhere directly, the way a house is not named in the deed to the land it stands on. Bread set to rise against the chimney's warm side. Fish turned again on the flake while the men mend twine. Water carried from a brook, the log calls, with no more ceremony than that, the brook. A photograph, loose in an envelope near the back of the folder, shows 3 women at a flake with turners in hand, faces turned from the camera toward the fish, as though the fish were the more urgent business, which, that day, it was. Early afternoon, and the file changes character all at once. Here the government forms begin, cream paper gone the color of weak tea, carbon smudged at the folds. Resettlement assistance, the heading reads, without further comment, as if the words carried their own weather. The form itself offered 2 things a household could choose between, though the file only preserves the boxes ticked, and not the talk that went into ticking them. A payment toward moving the house whole, or a smaller payment for those willing to leave it standing and start again elsewhere with nothing but the boat. Most households in this folder chose the house. It is not hard to understand why, reading the daybook beside it. A man who has spent 30 years paying down a debt in fish does not easily agree to leave the roof over that debt behind on the cobble. The program the forms belong to ran across Newfoundland through the middle of the last century into its later decades, moving families out of coves like this one into larger centers with roads and wharves that could take bigger boats, on the promise of schools, doctors, and work that did not depend on one fish alone. A cove needed most of its households to agree before the money came through, and the form here still carries the tally in someone's careful pencil. 9 families for, 2 against. The 2 names are not given, only the number, underlined once. Of the 2 families who voted against the move, the file gives no names and no reasons, but the wharf where the men mended twine was the same wharf where, that summer, the tally must have been argued out loud, bucket to bucket, long before any clerk wrote 9 for and 2 against on a form. A cove does not decide a thing like that quietly. Someone would have said what was always said on that coast against leaving, that a man born to a stage does not become a man born to a street simply by being moved there. The file does not record who said it. Someone did. I have read enough of these files now to know the underline usually meant nothing more than a clerk closing a column. But it sits differently on the page when you already know how the cove ends. By afternoon in the composite day I have built from these pages, the fog that lifted at noon has begun rolling back in off the water, the way it does most days on this stretch of coast, arriving low and gray along the surface before it climbs the hills behind the cove. The gulls know the tide's turn before any clock does, and shift from the stage heads to the flakes, walking the gaps between the drying fish with the particular sideways patience of a bird that has learned exactly how close it may come. The fish are gathered in before the damp can take them, stacked in what the log calls a faggot, a tight pile under canvas, and here the day's real work is done, the whole cove's fortune laid up under a tarp against tomorrow's sun. What went onto the barge with a house was decided, mostly by weight and by grief in roughly equal measure. A stove, if it could be freed from its brick and got down the stairs. A trunk of linens. A clock, always the clock, wound one last time in the old kitchen and carried out under someone's arm like a sleeping child. What stayed, mostly, was what the ground itself had grown too fond of. A root cellar dug into the hill, too much a part of the hill now to come free of it. A fence, a well. The stage, in every case but one, broken up instead for the barge's own deck, its old spruce legs put to one last use holding up something that would float. I want to stay in that ordinary afternoon a while, longer before the folder makes me leave it. Wood smoke from a dozen low chimneys lying flat under the returning fog instead of rising. A dog somewhere back of the stages, barking once, then nothing. Twine drying on a fence rail, pale as bone. But the forms are still in the folder, and the folder does not let the afternoon stay ordinary for long. The next page is dated a full decade after the tally I read a moment ago, and it is a bill of lading, not a survey. Household goods. 1 barge. Destination given as a resettlement site 40 miles down the coast, by name, a place with a proper road already in. What the bill does not say, because it did not need to, was how the houses themselves went. Whole houses, most of them, floated, set on empty oil drums lashed under the sills, towed out past the tickle behind a long liner or a government boat, the chimney still cold from the last fire, windows still in their frames. Along this whole coast, this was not one cove story, but dozens, hundreds of houses set adrift on purpose and towed like slow, square boats to a new shore, their owners standing at the new wharf to watch their own kitchens come in on the tide. Tolt Cove's own turn, by what the folder can tell me, came late in that program, one of the last coves on this stretch to sign the tally sheet. By then, there were only 9 houses left standing to move at all. By the time Tolt Cove's own tally came due, the people here had already watched it happen twice over on either side of them, coves along the same stretch of shore going dark a year or two apart, one chimney fewer smoking each winter on the horizon they had always known by its number of lights. There is a kind of resettlement that happens before the barge ever comes, in the slow arithmetic of who is left to marry, who is left to crew a boat, who is left to keep a school open past a single teacher's 2 years. Late afternoon in the composite day, then, is the day of the move itself, folded into the same file as every ordinary Tuesday that came before it, because to the archive it is only one more entry, filed by date, no different in weight from a weather log or a debt. The fog that afternoon, the log notes, was thick again, thick enough that the tow had to wait 2 hours past the planned hour for it to lift enough to see the second skerry, the same skerry named in the very first entry I read this morning. When it lifted, the boats went out one house at a time, the drums groaning under each hull as it took the water's weight, a sound the log describes in a rare moment of plain feeling from a clerk otherwise all numbers, as like the whole cove clearing its throat. One family, the file notes without further comment, asked to keep their stage standing rather than have it broken up for the barge deck, though there was no fish left to dry on it and no one left to walk it. The request was granted, no reason given either way. One family, the file does not say which, is remembered by a note in the surveyor's later visit as having walked up to the burying ground the morning of the move and stood there a while before going down to the wharf, though the note admits this may be no more than something the surveyor was told rather than something he saw. Whether it happened exactly so or not, I think it must have happened close enough to so in one house or another that summer or the one after. I think about that request longer than the file gives me any right to. A stage kept standing over an empty cove for a family already halfway down the coast in their own floating kitchen, because some things are harder to ask the sea to take back than a house. By evening in this day I have built for many days, the last house is well out past the tickle, its wake long gone flat behind it, and the cove that morning's log called thick as wool with fog is, if anything, quieter now than it was before first light. The schoolroom register's final entry is not dramatic. It simply stops. No closing notice, no ceremony recorded, only a blank column where the next roll call should be, the way a diary sometimes just ends mid-week because the hand that kept it had somewhere else, finally, to be. The merchant's daybook runs a little longer than the school log, closing out a few remaining accounts by mail, forwarding addresses in a new hand at the bottom of old pages, until even that thins to nothing, and the last page is simply left blank, tied shut with the rest. There is one more weather log entry in the folder, dated some years after the move, and it is the only one not written by a person paid to keep it. A visiting surveyor, passing the cove by boat, jotted it in the margin of his own field notes, and someone later copied it into this file for reasons the finding aid does not explain. Tolt Cove, he wrote, stages down, flakes down, one standing, leaning hard to seaward, poles gone soft and green with weed at the low water mark, fog in the tickle as always. As always, he wrote, though by then there was no one left in the cove for whom the fog was an always, only a surveyor passing through once, noting a weather he had no way of knowing was, For that place, the last weather anyone would trouble to record at all. Full dark, now, in the day I have built, no lamp is lit in any window because there is no window left with glass in it. The 9 houses are 40 miles down the coast, most of them still standing. Some of them, I am told, still lived in by grandchildren who know the name Tolt Cove only from a grandmother's saying of it. Most coves like this one left no folder at all. A family took what paper it had, a Bible with births written inside the cover, a rent book, and carried it onto the barge with the clock and the trunk of linens, and whatever did not fit went into the stove before the house went into the water. Tolt Cove kept its folder only because a school teacher, a merchant, and a government clerk each, in their own separate duty, thought their own pages worth keeping, without any one of them meaning to keep the cove itself. What is left in the cove itself, by every account I can find, and by the one visit a government biologist logged decades later for an unrelated survey of nesting gulls, is the one stage, further gone now, its legs black stumps in the cobble, and the flakes reduced to a scatter of spruce poles. The tide moves a little further every year. The gulls the biologist counted nest now in the old flake frames themselves, on the bare poles where cod once lay pale in ranks, their eggs set in the same low, wind-scoured spot a child once walked barefoot, turning fish for a summer's wage. The cove has not filled back in with water, exactly. The land is still land, the stones still stones. But the sea has taken back everything that was only ever borrowed from it, the way it always meant to, patiently, without asking anyone's leave. I close the folder now the way I found it, tape looped twice, the pencil word closed, still legible under the cove's name. Somewhere under all that paper, the actual sound of the place goes on without any ledger to hold it. Water lapping at what is left of the stage. A gull's call unspooling flat over water with no boat left to answer it. Old wood, the last few uprights, creaking at the tide's push the way a house creaks settling into a cold night, though this house has no roof left to keep the cold out. Fog in the tickle, as always, the surveyor wrote, not knowing there would be no one left to correct him if he was wrong. He was not wrong. The tide is turning now. What surfaced tonight will slip back under, the way these stories always do. But the water keeps them. It always carries them back. If you want to be here when it pulls away again, follow along, and the next one will find you. Until then, rest easy. The water remembers.